Julian Reed stared at his laptop screen, scrolling through rental listings with increasing desperation. The eviction notice on his kitchen counter seemed to mock him with every glance. 3 months behind on rent, crushing student debt from a photography degree that hadn't yielded the career he'd hoped for. Now this another rejection email from a potential employer. There has to be something, he muttered, running fingers through his unkempt brown hair. His studio apartment, barely large enough to fit his bed and photography equipment, was already the cheapest place he could find in the city. Or so he thought. The listing appeared suddenly, as if the algorithm had sensed his desperation. Private room in historic estate, $200 month. Utilities included. Remote location, transportation required. Some household duties expected. Immediate availability. Julian blinked twice. Sure, he'd misread the price. Properties in this region typically went for 5 times that amount. He clicked on the listing, revealing photos of a magnificent Gothic manor nestled among ancient trees. The architecture was stunning, exactly the sort of location he'd love to photograph. The catch had to be the remote location, he reasoned, though the listing didn't specify exactly where, before he could think better of it. Julian fired off an inquiry. The response came surprisingly fast, inviting him to an interview that very evening. The address led him to hours out of the city, deep into heavily wooded countryside. As Julian's aging Honda climbed the final hill, the manor materialized like something from a fever dream. All spires, gargoyles, and stained glass, silhouetted against the twilight sky. This can't be real, Julian whispered, double-checking. The address. His GPS confirmed he'd reached the right place, though his phone signal had disappeared miles back. A tall woman greeted him at the enormous front doors. Her pale skin seemed to glow in the fading light, contrasting sharply with her flowing black dress and immaculate dark hair, swept up in an intricate style that suggested wealth and antiquity. "Mr. Reed, I presume? I am Countess Liliana Blackwood. You're punctually appreciate that." Her voice carried the faintest accent Julian couldn't place. Eastern European, perhaps? "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice, Countess," Julian replied, trying to hide his awe at both the estate and the aristocratic title. "Your home is incredible. I'd love to photograph it sometime. A photographer?" Her ruby red lips curved into a smile. How ... fortuitous. "Please, follow me." The interior was even more impressive. Vaulted ceilings, ancient tapestries, antique furniture that museums would covet. Julian noticed curious modern additions, heavy blackout curtains, peculiar lighting fixtures that seemed unnecessarily dim, and an unusual lack of mirrors. "The room is modest but comfortable," the Countess explained, leading him through labyrinthine hallways. "I have several other tenants who value privacy and keep unusual hours. Would that be a problem?" Julian shook his head quickly. "Not at all. I'm flexible." They arrived at a small door tucked beneath a grand staircase. When opened, it revealed a space that could generously be described as a large closet, converted into an austere bedroom with just enough room for a twin bed and small dresser. "It's cozy," Julian managed, calculating how much space his camera equipment would take up. "The price reflects the accommodations," the Countess stated coldly. Regarding the contract, she produced a thick document bound in what appeared to be leather, oddly warm to the touch and inscribed with text so small Julian had to squint. "I'll need time to read through this," he began. "Of course," she replied with a dismissive wave, "though I must inform you I have 3 other applicants. Arriving shortly, the room will go to whoever commits first." Julian felt a cold prickle of warning down his spine, but his bank account balance flashed in his mind. $200. He could finally catch up on his student loans, build his portfolio with photographs of this architectural marvel. Was the worst that could happen? "Where do I sign?" he asked. The Countess's smile widened slightly, revealing teeth that seemed just a fraction too sharp. "Initial each page, sign the last. There's a small security deposit, merely a formality." Julian skimmed the document, catching phrases like regular contributions to household sustenance and emergency services as required, assuming they referred to chipping in for groceries and perhaps helping with maintenance. With a flourish of the antiquated fountain pen she provided, Julian signed his name. Excellent, the Countess purred, tucking the contract away. You may move in immediately. Dinner's at midnight. She turned to leave, then paused. One last thing, Mr. Reed. I strongly advise against wandering the East Wing between dawn and dusk. Some of our residents are light sensitive. As she glided away, Julian stood in the doorway of his new apartment, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. Outside, thunder rumbled across the darkening sky, and somewhere in the depths of the manor, Julian could have sworn he heard howling. Julian's first night in Blackwood Manor was punctuated by sounds that defied explanation, wailing echoes, heavy footsteps on the ceiling, and conversations in languages he'd never heard before. By morning, exhaustion had finally pulled him into fitful sleep, only to be awakened by a sharp knock. Breakfast, announced a gravelly voice. Julian opened his door to find a breakfast tray and a hulking figure retreating down the hallway. It was a man stood nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders that barely cleared the corridor. Thanks, Julian called out. The figure paused, turned slightly, revealing a face with distinctly lupin features, and nodded before continuing away. The tray contained coffee, toast, and a note written in elegant script. Please report to the study at noon for orientation. LB. Julian spent the morning unpacking his meager belongings and setting up his photography equipment. The promised modest room was indeed just a repurposed closet beneath the grand staircase. But at least it had a small window that offered dramatic views of the misty forests surrounding the property. At noon, precisely. Julian knocked on the heavy oak door of the study. Enter, the Countess's voice commanded. The room was dominated by a massive fireplace and walls lined with ancient books. The Countess sat behind a desk that appeared carved from a single piece of ebony. Mr. Reed, I trust. You slept well? She asked, without looking up from the parchment she was writing on. Not really, Julian admitted. It was a bit noisy. You'll adjust, she stated matter-of-factly, finally raising her gaze. Now, regarding house rules. First, your blood donation schedule. Julian blinked. My what? The Countess frowned. Clearly stated in Section 12, Paragraph 4 of your tenancy agreement. Each resident contributes to the household according to their abilities. Your monthly rent is supplemented by bi-weekly donations. Donations of blood. Julian's voice cracked, naturally. Nothing excessive, just a pint every other week. She waved dismissively. Our resident phlebotomist, Dr. Hemlock, is quite skilled. Julian's mind raced. I didn't agree to that. I assure you did. The Countess produced the contract, flipping to a specific page where Julian's initials clearly marked a paragraph about vital fluid contributions. I thought this was a normal rental arrangement. The Countess arched a perfect eyebrow. To read this manor houses 15 supernatural beings. I assumed the absurdly low rent made it obvious this was not a normal arrangement. Julian slumped into a nearby chair. Supernatural beings? Indeed. Myself and several others are vampires. We have 3 werewolves, including Grimbane, whom you met this morning. A family of ghosts in the East Wing, 2 banshees in the tower, and a particularly grumpy gargoyle on the north balcony. Julian stared, waiting for the punchline. None came. You're serious? Deadly? She replied with a hint of a smile. Section 23 also designates you as an emergency food source during supernatural crises, though I assure you we've only needed to invoke that clause twice in the past century. Julian stood abruptly. I'm leaving. I'm afraid that's not possible. The Countess's voice remained calm. Your contract binds you for a minimum of 1 year. Breaking it would activate the penalty clause, which is your soul becomes property of the manor. Traditionally, this results in ghosthood. Julian's legs gave out and he collapsed back into the chair. This is insane. This is supernatural real estate, Mr. Reed. The market is quite specialized. She softened slightly. If it helps, your photographic skills may prove useful. We pay handsomely for professional services beyond basic tenant duties. Before Julian could respond, the door burst open and a translucent woman in Victorian dress floated through. she wailed. "The pipes in the east wing are making that horrible." Shrieking again, and Tobias is shedding all over the library during his transformation. "Eleanor, we have discussed knocking," the Countess sighed. "Mr. Reed, meet Eleanor Coldwell, deceased 1873, one of our more dramatic residents." The ghost turned, noticing Julian. "A new human, how delightful. We haven't had a living tenant. Since that dreadful plumber, what happened to him again?" "He violated Section 36, the Countess replied stiffly. Eleanor nodded solemnly. "Ah, yes, poor man. The basement really is quite comfortable for a tomb, though." Julian's face drained of color. "Eleanor, please leave us," the Countess commanded. Once the ghost had departed, she turned back to Julian. "Ignore her theatrics. The plumber was merely transformed into a garden statue. Penalty varies based on the violation." Julian found his voice. "So I'm trapped here, donating blood to vampires, surrounded by werewolves and ghosts, with my soul as collateral." "Precisely." The Countess nodded approvingly. "You comprehend quickly for a human. Dinner is at midnight in the Great Hall. The wolves prefer their meat rare, but we provide well-done options for humans. Oh, and do photograph the sunrise from the West Terrace tomorrow. It's quite spectacular. And those of us who cannot see daylight would appreciate the images." As Julian stumbled back to his closet room, he began to wonder if student loan collectors might have been the lesser evil after all. 3 weeks into his residence at Blackwood Manor, Julian found himself in the vast library, photographing ancient texts for Tobias, the werewolf librarian. Despite his intimidating appearance, particularly during the full moon, Tobias had proven to be an unexpected ally, helping Julian navigate the supernatural politics of the household. "Hold the light higher," Tobias grumbled, his amber eyes focused on a crumbling manuscript. Even in human form, he retained wolfish features, elongated canines, pointed ears, and unusually thick facial hair that no amount of shaving could tame. Julian adjusted the specialized light he'd rigged to safely illuminate the fragile documents. "What language is this? It looks like Latin, but ... different." "Proto-Romanian vampire dialect," Tobias explained. "Countess Liliana's family records. She's hoping your photographs might reveal text that's fated to supernatural eyes." Julian had discovered that his camera captured supernatural elements invisible to the naked eye ghost manifestations. Aura shifts, and apparently hidden text in ancient vampiric documents. "How'd you end up here anyway?" Julian asked, snapping. "Another carefully framed shot?" Tobias snorted. Like most residents' desperate circumstances, didn't read the fine print. "Needed sanctuary during my first transformations. That was in 1943. 82 years as a tenant." Julian nearly dropped his camera. "Time moves differently when you're immortal," Tobias shrugged. "Besides, the library is mine to manage." Running with wild packs? Their conversation was interrupted by Eleanor, who materialized through a bookshelf, sending a cold draft through the room. "They're coming," she hissed, her translucent form flickering with agitation. "Hunters, at least. 6 of them." Tobias leapt to his feet, nostrils flaring. It sounded the alarm. Eleanor vanished through the ceiling while Tobias pulled a lever disguised as a candlestick. A low, reverberating bell echoed throughout the manor. "What's happening?" Dalian asked, hastily packing his equipment. "Vampire hunters," Tobias growled. "Already halfway to the door. Get to your room and lock yourself in. This isn't your fight." But as Julian hurried down the corridor, found himself face to face with 2 black-clad figures armed with crossbows and silver-tipped stakes. "Human!" one shouted, lowering his weapon slightly. "We're here to rescue you. How many others are trapped here?" Julian hesitated. Despite his bizarre circumstance, he realized he didn't feel like a prisoner needing rescue. "I'm not trapped. I live here." The hunters exchanged looks. "Stockholm Syndrome," one muttered. "Common with vampire thralls." "Not a thrall," Julian protested, backing away. "I'm a tenant with a photography side hustle." "Step aside," the lead hunter commanded. "We're cleansing this nest of abominations." A surge of protectiveness caught Julian by surprise. These were his housemates, strange as they might be. Eleanor, who left wildflowers by his door. Grim Bane, who fixed his leaky faucet. Even the Countess, who had actually complimented his sunrise. Photographs. Julian raised his camera and fired the flash directly into the hunter's eyes. They staggered back, temporarily blinded, giving Julian enough time to dash down a side passage and trigger the hidden panel Tobias had once shown him. The manor, chaos erupted. Julian glimpsed Eleanor and other ghosts creating freezing cold spots to disorient the invaders. Werewolves herded hunters into dead ends with strategic howls and growls. The Countess moved like shadow incarnate, disarming hunters with terrifying efficiency. Julian found himself cornered in the conservatory by a hunter who'd separated from the main group. "You're making a mistake, boy," the hunter snarled, raising a stake. "These monsters will drain you dry once you're no longer useful. Actually, there's a strict contract limiting blood donations," Julian retorted, backing against the glass wall. "And excellent dental benefits." As the hunter lunged, Julian's camera flash bought precious seconds. Enough for Grimbane to crash through the doorway and tackle the assailant with a feral roar. When the fight finally ended, the hunters had been subdued, not killed, Julian noted with relief. But bound with enchanted rope in the grand foyer, the Countess approached Julian. A small cut on her pale cheek, the only evidence she'd been in battle. "You helped defend us," she stated, surprised. Julian shrugged, seemed like the neighborly thing to do. For the first time, Liliana Blackwood smiled genuinely. "Perhaps Section 23 needs revision. You're proving to be more than just an emergency food source." Julian laughed, despite himself. "High praise indeed. What happens to them?" He nodded toward the hunters. "Memory modification," she replied. "Tobias has a spell. They'll wake up miles from here, believing they got lost in the woods." That night, Julian was invited to dine at the main table instead of the human corner, as supernatural beings raised glasses of various questionable liquids. In his honor, he realized he'd somehow found community in the strangest of places. "Hold still," Julian instructed as he adjusted his camera settings. "The light is perfect." Before him, Eleanor posed near the window where morning sunlight streamed through her translucent form, creating a prismatic effect. "I haven't had my portrait taken since 1871, she said excitedly. "Though I doubt I'll show up in your photographs." "That's the thing," Julian replied, snapping several shots. "You do show up, sometimes more than just your current form appears." Over 2 months into his tenancy, Julian had discovered his camera captured supernatural beings in ways even they couldn't perceive themselves. Eleanor's photographs revealed not just her ghostly present, but flickering images of her human past. Werewolf's pictures showed both their human and wolf aspects simultaneously. The vampires, who cast no reflection, appeared in his photographs with shadowy outlines of their former human selves. The Countess had taken particular interest in this phenomenon, commissioning Julian to photograph all residents for what she called historical documentation. "Remarkable," Julian murmured, reviewing Eleanor's images on his camera display. "Look." Eleanor floated closer, gasping at the sight. Within her ghostly outline appeared a clear image of her human self, a woman with an intricate hairstyle and determined eyes. "I'd forgotten what I looked like," she whispered. "Is that truly me? Your human essence?" Julian confirmed. The camera sees what remains." Later that afternoon, Julian was summoned to the Countess's private studia, rare invitation, he found. Her examining his photographs spread across her desk. "Your talent exceeds my expectations," she said without preamble. "These images reveal aspects of supernatural beings that have never been documented." "Thanks," Julian replied, still uncomfortable. With her formal manner, "I'm not sure why my camera does this." "Perhaps it's not the camera, but the photographer," she suggested, her crimson eyes studying him intently. "Humans with sensitivity to the supernatural are rare but not unknown." Julian shifted uneasily. "About my contract. I've been here almost 3 months. Is there any way to renegotiate some terms? The blood donations are becoming ... double quotes, draining," she supplied with a hint of amusement. "Exactly." The Countess gestured for him to sit. "There is something I haven't told you about this manor and its residents. Something that may contextualize your presence here." Julian leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "Blackwood Manor exists at a rare intersection of supernatural ley lines," she explained. It serves as neutral territory and sanctuary for beings who would traditionally be enemies. Werewolves and vampires, spectral entities and corporeal ones, are coexistence. Here is unprecedented. Supernatural apartment complex, Julian suggested. She grimaced at the modern comparison. If you must, but this piece is fragile. Centuries of conflict don't disappear overnight, even with contracts binding us. That's why your photographs are so valuable. They remind us of our shared humanity, the mortal origins we've all lost touch with. Julian considered this. So I'm not just here as a convenient blood bag. That was initially the case, she admitted candidly. But your unique perspective, through your lens and your humanity, affords something none of us can provide. A bridge between worlds. What are you suggesting? Amendment to your contract? The Countess produced a document that glowed faintly in the dim room. Reduce blood donations in exchange for your services as manor photographer and historian. Document our existence, our stories, our histories, both separate and intertwined. Julian was surprised by the appeal of this proposition. And my soul remains collateral? Naturally, she smiled. We are still supernatural beings, after all. Before Julian could respond, Tobias burst into the room, his expression grave. The council representatives have arrived early, he announced. All 7 factions. The Countess rose immediately. They weren't due for another fortnight. Something's happened. They're demanding an emergency conclave. She turned to Julian. It seems you'll witness supernatural politics firsthand. The Supernatural Council convenes rarely, only when threats affect all our kinds. What does that mean? Julian asked, following them down the corridor. It means, Tobias growled, that something is hunting not just vampires or just werewolves, but all of us. Something that doesn't distinguish between supernatural classifications. Humans, Julian suggested hesitantly. The Countess shook her head. Something worse. Something old. They entered the Great Hall, now transformed with 7 distinct seating sections. Representatives of vampire covens, werewolf packs, ghost collectives, banshee sisterhoods, gargoyle clutches, witch covens, and Phi courts filled the room with a cacophony of languages and an overwhelming sense of power. Remember, the Countess whispered to Julian, no photographs during the conclave without explicit permission. Some beings believe cameras capture more than images, they can trap essences. As Julian took his place in a corner designated for manor residents, he realized how thoroughly his understanding of reality had transformed. 3 months ago, his biggest worry had been student loans. Now he was witnessing a gathering of beings, straight from mythology, discussing threats to their collective existence, and somehow, improbably, he belonged among them. 1 year to the day after signing his fateful contract, Julian stood on the manor's highest tower, photographing the blood-red sunset. His equipment had expanded considerably. The Countess had proven surprisingly generous with his photography. Budget once she recognized its value to the supernatural community. Capturing the last light? Asked a familiar voice. Julian turned to find Eleanor hovering nearby, her form more solid than it had been when they first met. His photographs had helped her reconnect with her human essence, strengthening her manifestation. The vampires requested a sunset series, Julian explained. Since they can't see it themselves, you've changed things here, Eleanor observed. 150 years I've haunted these halls, and I've never seen vampires request images. Of sunlight or werewolves voluntarily sit for portraits with their packs? Julian shrugged modestly, but he knew she was right. His photographs had become more than documentation. They were healing old wounds between supernatural factions, helping them remember their shared experiences, despite their differences. The council meeting 6 months earlier had revealed a threat that required unprecedented cooperation. Human extremists using advanced technology to detect and eliminate supernatural beings. Julian's human perspective had proven invaluable in understanding their methods and developing countermeasures. Your contract renewal meeting is tonight, isn't it? Eleanor asked. Julian nodded, trying to mask his nervousness. Despite his contributions, he remained bound by supernatural law. The Countess could choose to enforce the original terms, returning him to basic tenant status or worse. As twilight deepened, Julian packed his equipment and descended to the study where his supernatural journey had begun. The Countess wasn't alone. Tobias stood beside her desk, along with representatives from each supernatural faction residing in the manor. "Julian Reed," the Countess began formally, "your one-year tenancy contract expires at midnight. We have convened to determine its disposition." Julian straightened his shoulders. "I'd like to propose new terms." A murmur ran through the assembled beings. Humans rarely negotiated with supernatural entities. "Your proposal?" the Countess asked, one eyebrow arched. Julian produced a document he'd spent weeks preparing. "I wish to remain at Blackwood Manor as its official historian and mediator. In exchange for comprehensive documentation of supernatural histories and continued diplomatic services between factions, I request larger quarters, exemption from emergency food source status, and reduction of blood donations to quarterly rather than bi-weekly." Tobias grinned, showing pointed teeth. "Bold demands from a human." "From your historian," Julian corrected, "who has proven his value." The supernatural representatives exchanged glances. Finally, a vampire elder spoke. "The humans' images have shown us aspects of ourselves long forgotten. This has ... value." His understanding of human hunters proved crucial during the council crisis. Added a werewolf representative, the Countess studied Julian with an inscrutable expression. "And what of your previous life? Your human connections and ambitions?" Julian considered this carefully. "I've found purpose here that I never had there. My photography has meaning beyond aesthetics. I'm documenting histories that would otherwise be lost." "And the blood donations?" she pressed. "A reasonable price for supernatural community," Julian conceded with a small smile. "Though I'd prefer a more modern collection method." Unexpected laughter rippled through the room. The Countess rose, her pale features solemn. "Julian Reed, we accept your terms with one amendment." She produced a glowing quill, signed not in ink, but in blood freely given. "This will bind you to Blackwood Manor beyond tenancies, a recognized ally of all supernatural kinds, under our protection and bound by our laws." Julian understood the significance. This wasn't just a rental agreement. It was acceptance into a world few humans ever glimpsed, let alone joined. "There will be consequences," she warned. "Prolonged exposure to supernatural energies changes humans in unpredictable ways. You may not remain entirely human yourself." Julian thought of the strange dreams he'd been having, his increasingly acute night vision, and how he sometimes sensed emotions not his own when photographing supernatural beings. The transformation had already begun. "I understand," he said, pricking his finger and taking the quill. As Julian signed, the document shimmered with ancient power. The contract dissolved into particles of light that briefly swirled around him, before settling onto his skin like luminescent tattoos, then fading from view. "It is done," the Countess declared. "Welcome, Julian Reed, historian of Blackwood Manor." Later that night, in his new quarters, a spacious suite in the West Wing, with a perfect view of both sunset and moonrise. Julian reviewed photographs from his first day at the manor, his desperate expression, the Countess's calculating gaze. His tiny closet room. So much had changed. He had changed. A knock interrupted his reflections. "Enter," he called, somehow knowing it was Eleanor before she materialized. "The residents are gathering in the Great Hall," she announced. "A celebration in your honor. Apparently we've never had a human officially join the household before. The vampires have even brought blood wine for toasting." Julian laughed. "Tell them I'll be right down. I just need to finish something." After she departed, Julian opened his laptop and typed a final email to his student loan servicer. The photography work he'd been commissioned to do for various supernatural factions paid surprisingly well, enough to clear his human debts entirely. As he closed the computer, Julian caught his reflection in the window glass. For a moment, his eyes seemed to flash with an inner light that hadn't been there before. Whatever he was becoming, it would certainly make for interesting photographs.